The threats to our democracy have gone local. American democracy didn't crumble in one fell swoop under the administration of a president with disregard for rule of law or under the weight of a mob storming the Capitol or under a wave of candidates who claimed the 2020 election was rigged. Though some election deniers did win critical midterm races, the most prominent, Republicans like Kari and Mark Finchem in Arizona and Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, lost their 2022 campaigns. As a result, some voters might have concluded that the movement died beyond Donald Trump's continued claims. That would be a serious mistake, because though it has receded from the headlines, election denialism has not died. It has just gone down ballot. In some state and local offices across the country, election denialism is still recasting how elections are conducted, in ways big and small. With far less effort than it would take on a national level, Republican officials are gumming up the mechanics of local election administration, making it harder to cast a vote, harder to tally votes and harder to get results in a timely fashion. Officials are policing elections, establishing task forces and election police units that are supposedly there to root out fraud but could have the effect of intimidating voters from exercising their civic right. Every little bit of friction that's added to the election process makes it that much harder for it to function. Through the typical channels of government bureaucracy and under the pretense of merely asking questions, these conspiracy theory-influenced Republicans are often creating this friction for their own voters. Their actions might seem like inconsequential outliers, but it's there at this grassroots level that our voting system is most vulnerable. Which means these obscure election boards aren't where denialism goes to die, it's where it takes root and starts to grow. Just last month, North Carolina state election officials voted to remove 2 local election officials. In November the pair initially refused to certify election results, though one ultimately did, as well as in a redo election this year after a bizarre circumstance in which a poll worker was accused of telling voters at one precinct that a candidate had died. The officials questioned state election practices and a 2018 federal court decision striking down strict voter ID requirements North Carolina had in place at the time. "We feel that the election was held according to the law that we have, but that the law is not right," one said. The incident is just the latest in a string of examples of the ways that election deniers' conspiratorial distrust of elections continues to affect state and local elections. These kinds of disputes and claims cropped up again and again in local jurisdictions last year. Whether it was initially refusing to certify elections, as officials in Cochise County, Arizona, threatened or hand-counting ballots, as they moved to do in Nye County, Nevada, or voting to outright get rid of voting machines and sue the Secretary of State, as happened in Otero County, NM, the long tail of the big lie has created disorder in local election administration. Perhaps the widest-reaching example of structural interference in elections is the growing list of states that have pulled out of the bipartisan nonprofit data consortium known as the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC. ERIC was created to help states maintain accurate voter rolls through information sharing. It helps guard against fraud by allowing states to cross-check for inaccurate or outdated voting records and helps identify potential new voters who haven't yet registered. Since its founding in the 2010s, ERIC existed in relative obscurity. Over the past year, however, ERIC has become the subject of conspiracy theories and attacks, including by Mr. Trump, who has said it pumps the rolls for Democrats. Louisiana was the first state to announce it would pull out, in late 2022, followed by Alabama, whose incoming Secretary of State did so on his first day in office this year. Since then, the Republican Secretaries of State in Florida, Iowa, Missouri, Ohio and West Virginia have announced their intention to leave. The latest wave of departures came after some Republican members tried but failed to make changes to ERIC's leadership to guard against what they consider to be partisanship, as well as changes to the program, including a removal of the requirement that member states reach out to residents who are eligible to vote but unregistered. Some of these requested changes are debatable matters of policy, but those meetings also came after the flurry of conspiratorial attacks on ERIC over the past year. The irony, however, is that leaving ERIC could very well make their elections less secure. Just this past January, Florida's new Office of Election Crimes and Security used ERIC data to identify more than 1,000 voters who appeared to have voted in more than one state. In February, the month before he decided to withdraw, the Iowa Secretary of State told NPR that ERIC was a godsend. Without this cross-checking tool at their disposal in the future, it's possible for these instances to slip through the cracks, but it's difficult to know just what the full effect of a weakened ERIC will be. It's also notable that the institutions being targeted by election denier conspiracy theories are often some of the most mundane, making it hard to predict what will be targeted next. After the 2020 elections, Republican legislators' attacks on ballot drop boxes, early voting windows and other measures intended to make voting easier were somewhat to be expected. But the moves by election administrators to go after a bipartisan organization like ERIC only add to the chaos that has become election denialism's calling card. The anti-democratic legacy that once denied the franchise to Black Americans and women is a part of the American story. Today, threats to democracy can be as varied as the states, counties and municipalities where they're happening, thanks to the confusing patchwork of election laws and powers that change from state to state. But to the extent that they infringe on the voting rights of any part of the electorate, these moves matter to all of us, because they threaten the entire project of American democracy. The threats to our democracy have gone local. American democracy didn't crumble in one fell swoop under the administration of a president with disregard for rule of law or under the weight of a mob storming the Capitol or under a wave of candidates who claimed the 2020 election was rigged. Though some election deniers did win critical midterm races, the most prominent, Republicans like Kari and Mark Finchem in Arizona and Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania,